first in a series of conversations we can have in the community and hopefully throughout the region and throughout the nation. As you know, the title of our event tonight is Ferguson, a wide-angle view, ideas, and community discussion. I hope we can realize all of those things. My name is George Leiner. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy here at the college. On behalf of the college, the Office of Multicultural Student Life, and myself, I'd like to welcome you to this event. For helping us put this evening together, I'd like especially to thank Olivia Thomas, Coordinator of Multicultural Student Life and Resident Life, Mary Collins, Vice President of Student Affairs, and Professor Bruce Ankoviak. And of course, all of our speakers and in order of appearance, Dr. Eric Kosian, Assistant Professor of Criminology, Law, and Society here at the college, Dr. Tim Kelly, Professor and Chair of the History Department, Candace Reagan on the end, a graduate of the college in 2003 and became law in 2006. She's a member of the law firm Burns White and a former assistant solicitor in the City of Pittsburgh Law Department and former associate attorney for the Allegheny County Office of Common Counsel and a colleague and adjunct faculty member with Dr. Kosian in Criminology, Law, and Society at St. Vincent. And Nubia Williams, who you know, will graduate from the college in May. I saw 15 here.
Yes, May 9th is the day.
Yeah, okay, all right, very good. Soon to be graduating senior at the college and club president of the Visionaries of Rome. Unfortunately, unable to attend the illness was Mr. Gennard Pendleton, who would have been here with us but is sick this evening. All right, the schedule for the evening, after I get done with these remarks, we will hear from Dr. Kosian on the events on the ground of August 9th, 2014. Dr. Kelly will provide us the historical context for these events. Ms. Reagan will provide us with a constitutional look and look issued at civil rights law and from the perspective of what it was like to experience these as a student at St. Vincent College and a young adult, Ms. Nubia Williams. Then at 8 o'clock, we will start a general discussion, and we've talked about this. Depending on how the discussion is flowing, we may just continue as a general discussion, though the original plan was to, with the chairs, to break it up into smaller groups for smaller discussions to continue the engagement. But we'll see how it flows at that point. For my part, this part of thinking that this was a good idea that we would do an event like this at the college, it started with my direct reaction to those events on August 9, 2014, when Mr. Michael Brown, 18, and Officer Darren Wilson, 28, left the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, and a tragic event unfolded. The feelings that I had at that point echoed those of almost 50 years ago. It was really quite uncanny. The spring and summer of 1968, when in April Martin Luther King Jr. fell to an assassin's bullet, and in June Bobby Kennedy was struck down. I experienced those events of 50 years ago with an enormous, almost overwhelming sense of sadness. I took them to be symptoms of a profound dysfunction still deeply embedded in the American psyche. I knew that it meant that if we were going to free ourselves from this dysfunction, a long and difficult and painful process lay ahead of us. And even though I knew that it was going to be very difficult for the nation, and the riots that ensued and the great trauma of that did not surprise me at all, I still had confidence that the strength of the U.S., and particularly of my generation, would make becoming healthier at least a possibility. And the events of this past August showed just how far we have yet to go, even with the enormous progress we've made. 6 years ago, almost to this day, Attorney General Eric Holder, in a speech at the Department of Justice delivered on the occasion of Black History Month, made a series of observations that were both prescient and apropos to our current circumstance. He called for us to use Black History Month as an occasion to begin a series of dialogues on our racial past and a future diversity which we hope would be free of the same type of invidious racial discrimination in the past. He acknowledged that these discussions would be awkward and painful. For while in the workplace we have substantially brought our lives together, when we leave those lives of work, there remains very little overlap in the social sphere. And we can even see something of this here at the college when we glance around the cafeteria each day. Holder called for a nuanced, principled, and spirited discussion, one which would begin with an acknowledgement and examination of our frequently violent history of race relations. And quite, I think very appropriately enough, just 5 days ago, James B. Comey, the director of the FBI, gave a speech at Georgetown that was remarkably similar in calling for discussions throughout our nation. But discussions that would acknowledge our frequently violent history of race relations, of slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, but failed social and political conciliation, even though with that Reconstruction. The 1950s and 60s of massive political and social accommodation, but with little social acceptance of each other in our personal lives. So tonight we begin. But what may we hope to accomplish? The first stage is surely one of increased understanding. If we can together begin to tease out the complex causal circumstances from which issued forth the deadly confrontation last August in Ferguson, we will have done well. If we begin to see that this event was not of just one moment or of one day, but of a decade and perhaps 2 centuries, we may begin to see the outlines of what brought this event about. And with causes identified, then we may begin the process of finding ways to interrupt the chain of causes, a chain which undermines hope, which makes it nearly impossible to find a sense of future for so many of our citizens, and particularly for young black men. Perhaps tonight we can take our own steps in this national conversation, steps whose ultimate goal is the creation of a future in which our diversity is seen as a source of strength and not of profound division, mistrust, and hatred. So, let us not, as Attorney General Holder put it, succumb to cowardice and refuse to engage each other on this enormously difficult question of race in society. Let us gather our courage, speak with eloquence, listen with understanding, and get about finding ways to build the society in which we all wish to live. Very good. And with that, Dr. Coach.
Good evening. The following is a narrative of events that took place in the town of Ferguson, Missouri on Saturday, August 9th, 2014. From 11:48 a.m. until 12 noon, Officer Darren Wilson was responding to a call of a sick child. At 11:51 a.m., a call came in about a robbery at a convenience store. The dispatcher gave a description of the robber and said the suspect was walking toward the Quick Trip convenience store. Somewhere between 12 and 12:01, Officer Wilson encountered Michael Brown. He was unaware that Michael Brown was a suspect in the robbery of the convenience store. Wilson stopped Brown and another male because the two were walking down the middle of the street and stopped for midday traffic. Between 12:01 and 12:04 p.m., Michael Brown was shot 8 times and killed by Officer Wilson. 12:04 p.m., a second officer arrived on the scene, followed by a supervisor 1 minute later. An ambulance responding to the earlier sick person call drove by and responded to assess Brown. That is the timeline for the sequence of events that has brought us here this evening. 13 minutes from the time the 911 call came in to the time a robbery suspect was shot dead in the street. 13 minutes that not only changed the course of the Brown family, the Wilson family, and the community, but 13 minutes that propelled the justified and legitimate use of deadly force to a media frenzy where false narratives and misinformation fueled riots, looting, and racial tensions to levels unprecedented in my lifetime. And while race and race relations have been at the heart of news reports, vigils, and protests following the grand jury decision to not indict Officer Wilson, it is irrelevant for my 10 minutes this evening. Let me say that again. Race meant nothing in the events that took place on Saturday, August 9th from 11:51 a.m. until 12:04 p.m. from a law enforcement perspective. In the aftermath of those 13 minutes, however, stories were circulated about an unarmed black youth being executed by a white police officer. Hands up, don't shoot became a catchphrase that made its way to t-shirts and bullhorns. Racism and police brutality claims dominated conversations. And the number of rounds fired into Michael Brown became a point of contention, while the real facts of the case and the behavior of the offender did not matter so much. To the best of my ability, with verified information made available, I will do my best to address some of the things that took place in those 13 minutes from a criminology and law enforcement perspective. In addressing the number of rounds fired into an unarmed male and whether or not that numeric value is excessive, I'm going to rely on material from my Criminology of Firearms course, where we discuss factors that affect an offender's reaction to being shot that are broken down into 3 distinct categories. Number 1, the offender's mental state. Number 2, factors that affect a bullet's terminal performance in the intended target. And number 3, wound trauma. The most difficult factor to discern with certainty is an offender's state of mind. Some of the factors that may impact how an offender reacts to a non-vital gunshot wound or his mental state include, but are not limited to, alcohol consumption, the prevalence of drugs in his system, psychotic tendencies, signs of intense emotional agitation, and/or demonstrating a firm determination to inflict as much harm as possible before being stopped. Anyone exhibiting any of these traits are less likely to break down mentally or become incapacitated by non-vital gunshot wounds than offenders who do not exhibit these traits. In other words, if someone fits into one of these 5 categories, a non-fatal gunshot wound to them will not produce the same outcome as a non-fatal gunshot wound to someone under no such conditions. An autopsy report indicated Michael Brown tested positive for marijuana. Marijuana does not have the same physiological effects as cocaine or amphetamines, but the fact remains that he was under the influence of a controlled substance at the time of the shooting that is deemed a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act. Perhaps more paramount in this story than the presence of marijuana is the idea of Michael Brown's determination versus his desperation. It has been supported by numerous witness accounts, as well as forensic evidence gathered from the crime scene, that Michael Brown attacked Officer Wilson through Wilson's open car window when Wilson asked Brown to get out of the middle of the street. Reports and evidence suggest after he struck Officer Wilson in the face, he attempted to take his firearm from the officer and made comments that Wilson was too much of a coward to shoot him. At least 1, perhaps 2 rounds were discharged in the vehicle following this attempt by Brown to take the weapon. In the FBI Academy, and I am sure in police academies all over the country, the most important lessons, the ones that have the most time allocated for study and classroom instruction, deal with the use of deadly force. Every law enforcement officer can recite their deadly force policy long after they graduate their academics, because it was pounded into them more so than anything else. In addition to the deadly force policy, all recruits know full well that if they lose their weapon in a struggle, they will lose their life. This is not a variable in our discipline. It is a constant. To help illustrate this, FBI recruits were told about a study of police homicides that was done over a 10-year span, looking into police deaths while on duty. The one constant that remained amongst every slain officer was the fact that every time he or she lost their gun, they also lost their life. The implication is simple. You lose your gun, you lose your life. Period. When Michael Brown attempted to take Officer Wilson's weapon, he himself elevated that particular situation into a life or death one. Unable to steal the weapon from the officer, Brown moved away from the car and the officer, despite committing his 2nd felony of the day. Said Wilson, explaining the struggle in the police cruiser, quote, "When I grabbed him, the only way I can describe it is I felt like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan. He looked up at me and had the most intense, aggressive face," end quote. It was at this point in time, Officer Wilson, a trained and competent officer, responded to the call of duty and exited his vehicle to detain and apprehend Michael Brown for the attack on a police officer. As Wilson exited the vehicle, witness accounts and forensic evidence suggest that Brown, who was 6 foot 4 inches tall and weighed approximately 300 pounds, ignored the commands of the officer and charged at Wilson. Now, it should be noted at this point in the narrative that acts of desperation should not be confused with acts of determination. Acts of desperation occur when an offender acts or reacts out of panic and/or desperation, such as trying to flee. Acts of desperation typically involve flight away from a confrontation. Determination, however, occurs when an offender is mentally resolved to stay in the fight, or he is acting with sheer willpower, despite injury, to drive on in an attempt to accomplish his ruthless personal mission of destruction. In these cases, he is acting with determination to move toward a confrontation. Once it is established that determination, and not desperation, is at the heart of the motives of an offender, a life or death decision on the part of the officer has to be made immediately, as was the case in Ferguson. Having already been attacked once and nearly losing his weapon, and subsequently his life, Officer Wilson fired 7 rounds into Michael Brown as Brown charged at him. In his testimony, Officer Wilson said of Michael Brown that it, quote, looked like he was almost balking up to run through the shots, like it was making him mad that I was shooting at him, end quote. The 8th and final trigger press from Wilson's gun resulted in a round striking Michael Brown in the head and immobilizing him immediately. To fully understand if Officer Wilson's actions were legitimate, justified, and under the code of law, we must look at the use of force continuum. Law enforcement agencies have policies that guide their use of force. These policies describe an escalating series of actions an officer may take to resolve a situation. The continuum generally has many levels, and officers are instructed to respond with a level of force appropriate to the situation at hand, acknowledging that the officer may move from one part of the continuum to another in a matter of seconds. Step 1, officer presence. No force is used. This is considered the best way to resolve a situation. The mere presence of a law enforcement officer works to deter crime or diffuse a situation. Officers' attitudes are professional and non-threatening. Step 2, verbalization. Force is not physical. Officers issue calm, non-threatening commands such as, let me see your identification and registration. Officers may increase their volume and shorten their commands in an attempt to gain compliance. Short commands might include stop or don't move. Step 3, empty hand control. Officers use bodily force to gain control of a situation. There's the soft technique, where the officers use grabs, holds, and joint locks to restrain an individual. There's the hard technique, where officers use punches and kicks to restrain an individual. Step 4 is the less lethal methods, where officers use less lethal technologies to gain control of a situation, such as a baton, a projectile, chemical sprays, or tasers. Step 5, lethal force. Officers use lethal weapons to gain control of a situation. This should only be used if a suspect poses a serious threat to the officer or another individual. Officers use deadly weapons such as firearms to stop an individual's actions. Seeing as how Michael Brown elevated the interaction between himself and Officer Wilson to the point that Brown posed a serious threat to the officer and potentially other individuals, the only course of action Officer Wilson had was to exercise deadly force. This was not a decision brought about by Officer Wilson, nor was it one motivated by race. This was the by-the-book shooting where a variety of misinformation, diffusion of responsibility, and the irrelevant demographics stole the show. The facts of the case are indisputable, backed up by witness accounts, expert testimony, and forensic evidence. From a criminology and law enforcement perspective, the facts do nothing but exonerate the actions of Officer Wilson, even though this is not a trial of any sort. Race really played no role in the events that took place on August 9th, 2014, in those fateful 13 minutes. And there is no evidence to suggest the outcome would be different if Officer Wilson were black and Michael Brown were white. The only difference, perhaps, would be in the media coverage and the outcry. Thank you.
Now we have the sense of the particular events that August afternoon evening. Now, we'll see if we can pull it back and take a look at the context, the history behind that particular confrontation at that particular moment.
One of the great things about this panel is we're going to have a disagreement, I think. The first one is, Dr. Ferguson said it had nothing to do with this. I want to argue the opposite, where he said everything to do with this. This was all about race. And I'm going to do that by taking us through the context of what's up to that. I'm not going to talk about the particulars of that moment. I'm going to talk about what... Is that good? Or, yeah, no, that's okay with me. Are you guys okay?
Yeah.
All right, sorry. Okay. Okay, why did Derek shoot Michael Brown? There is a context in this local context. Local communities, states, and nations have long continuing practice of racial discrimination that has consistently targeted African Americans for special disfavor, and the local and state police have often enforced those policies. They've been the coercive arm of those policies throughout our history. When Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown, his action made him an actor in a long history of coercion against African Americans in racially tense situations. George mentioned James Comey's comments last week. He said all of us in law enforcement must be honest enough to acknowledge that much of our history is not pretty. At many points in American history, law enforcement enforced the status quo, a status quo that was often brutally unfair to disfavored groups. And I'll say that's the context in which we can have a fuller understanding of the incidents that happened in the This is a photo of Alabama State Police beating John L. Lewis at the end of the Pettus Bridge. My story starts with the Great Migration, and it could start earlier than that, but I have 12 minutes, so I'm going to as fast as I can. African Americans moved north from the south in two great waves of migration, one in the early 20th century, roughly 1900 to about 1930, and then from 1941 to 1970. And you can see that the patterns follow essentially railroad lines. So people coming to St. Louis and the St. Louis area, and eventually to Ferguson would be coming out of kind of the upper Mississippi, Alabama area that way. People coming to the Pittsburgh area would have come up through Georgia, South Carolina. Probably these are predominant patterns. They're not exclusive. You could probably find people who don't fit those patterns. So how do people, whites in St. Louis, respond to that? And there are a series of practices. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I will talk about some: restrictive covenants, zoning changes, federal housing policies, court decisions, sundown towns, race-based exclusion from employment, and discriminatory professional loan practices. We're going to touch on a number of those. The first is restrictive covenants. In the early 20th century, when whites discovered African Americans moving to the neighborhood, they very clearly to that, they devised something called a restrictive covenant, which is a contract that you sign when you buy a piece of property using all cities all over America. This happens to be an excerpt from one used in St. Louis. And I've tried to use St. Louis examples wherever I can to talk about these. You can see in the top, whereas it is the mutual benefit and advantage of all the parties of the first part, meaning the white members of the community, to preserve the character of said neighborhood as a desirable place of residence for persons of the Caucasian race. The goal of this codicil is to protect the white members of the community. There are two restrictions in the covenant. First, you can't have a slaughterhouse in the neighborhood. I think we could all understand why you wouldn't want to have a slaughterhouse in the neighborhood. The second, though, is you can't sell, convey, lease, or rent to Negro or Negroes, to deliver possession, or to permit to be occupied by Negro or Negroes. You can't, if you own property, you can't sell it to an African American. If you own property, you can't rent it to an African American. If you own property and you're married to an African American, your husband or wife can't move in with you into the property. It's a restrictive covenant that was enforced by legal court decisions and universally and federally. And we'll see it was recognized by the federal government as a beneficial aspect of the neighborhood. In 1916 in St. Louis, there was an effort to pass an ordinance prohibiting people from crossing from one neighborhood into another. If you were black, you couldn't move into a neighborhood that was 75% or more white. If you're white, you couldn't move into a neighborhood that was 75% or more black. This is a postcard that was used to persuade people in St. Louis to vote in favor of that ordinance. And you can see what is a picture of a series of houses, and there are X's marked above those homes that are occupied by African Americans. The implication being this is coming to your neighborhood as well. You've got to vote for this ordinance. The was a vote on the ordinance, and the ordinance passed by a margin of 3-1. The Supreme Court, a year later, in the case of Louisville, Kentucky, said it was not constitutional to have these kinds of ordinances. Less formally, but very pervasively, were something called Sundown towns. Sundown towns were communities that prohibited the presence of African Americans after dark. You can see this as a sign from one of those Sundown towns, whites only within city limits after dark. We've had many accounts that suggest that Ferguson was a Sundown town. That Ferguson prevented African Americans from entering the town after dark. Right next to Ferguson was a community called Kinloch, which was an African American northern suburb of St. Louis, and the road that connected them was called Suburban Avenue, and they set up barricades across Suburban Avenue to keep African Americans from coming into Ferguson after dark. In the 1930s, the federal government determined that home ownership was a positive characteristic of citizenship. If you owned your home, you'd be a more dedicated and, I guess, wise citizen. And so the Federal Housing Administration underwrote loans. So if you borrowed a loan from a bank and you defaulted on the loan, the federal government would come in and pick up the amount that you still owe. But they didn't want to risk a lot of money doing that, and so they said, we're going to underwrite the loans that banks make to people in safe neighborhoods only, not in unsafe neighborhoods. And they created maps for every metropolitan area in America, and they took, you can see the different letters. For some reason, we used numbers, letters, and then we used other kinds of language to describe it. But essentially, if you lived in a neighborhood that was deemed to be unstable, you got a red line drawn around your neighborhood. If you lived in a neighborhood that was deemed to be stable, you got a green line. If you wanted an FHA mortgage, you had to live in a green-lined neighborhood. And you can see this is St. Louis, although if you want to go north, you have to tilt it like that. This is St. Louis. The green-lined neighborhoods are where the FHA would underwrite mortgages, and the red-line neighborhoods are where they would not. One of the characteristics for becoming a red-line neighborhood was if you were a predominantly African-American neighborhood, you were red-line. If you were a mixed neighborhood, in other words, if you were racially integrated, then you were a red-line neighborhood. This started in the 1930s. You can see this particular map is from 1937, but it was used up until the early 1960s, and we'll see that mortgage companies continue to use similar things today for targeting who they're going to lend money to buy a home or not. This is really important for a number of reasons. Obviously, it seems unseemly to us today, but also home ownership is how people move from the working class into the middle class in America. That's how we had this great transformation in the middle of the 20th century. People building equity in their homes is how we moved from working poor into comfort. Closing the avenue to African Americans meant that they weren't able to make that transition in the same way that whites were. And the wealth gap as a result of that is enormous today. The average African American has only 5% of the wealth of the average white person. It's an incredible disparity. Income is not as disparate, but still disparate. Wealth is amazingly so. And finally, mortgage companies continue to discriminate based on race today even, and we'll see evidence of that in just a little bit, so that African Americans still face a more difficult time getting loans and building wealth and becoming more secure in their lives. Here's a wealth gap over time, just from '83 to 2010. You can see the disparity is fairly significant. This is for white wealth, and this is Hispanic wealth, and this is African American. I apologize for moving quickly, but I want to keep on schedule. Racial discrimination continues to exist. Wells Fargo just paid an $860 million fine for charging African Americans higher mortgage rates than whites between 2004 and 2009. And actually, you can flip that around and say giving discounts to whites to buy homes that were not available to African Americans. And this is relatively recent. Citigroup also paid a fine of $395 million for similar violations. The practice is no longer supported by the FHA, but it is practiced by banks and other mortgage companies. By the way, the FHA in the first 20 years of its mapping, in order to get a green line designation, required that communities use a restrictive covenant to keep African Americans out, and that was key to getting that green line status. So the power of both government policies and personal discriminatory practices is pretty significant. In the mid-1900s, in part as an effort to keep the black ghetto contained within the geographic boundary, we developed public housing projects. This is one of the most famous in America. This is the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex, completed in 1954. People started moving in. I think its peak residency was 90% occupancy in about 1957. But in order to meet demands for greater production efficiency in the construction, they shrank the kitchens and they didn't have any upkeep, so that there was no repairs done to the apartments as they deteriorated. And by 1967, I think there were only 900 families out of a potential 5,500 families living in the housing complex. The result of which is destruction of the complex in the 1970s. And those of you who live in Pittsburgh may know that East Liberty once had these high-rise public housing projects as well, and they're gone. In place now, Section 8 housing allows poor people to get federal subsidy in order to move out into other areas, and that seems to be a much more effective public housing policy than the kind of high concentration and high-rise recovery. There are all sorts of other problems with the buildings that we can talk about in the discussion period if we want, that made it difficult for them to succeed, including amount of elevator services, an 11-story building, but the elevator didn't go even on before. So it's a problematic existence. But where do these people go then, once the buildings are gone and once they begin to abandon? Where do African Americans move? And the one place that they began to move in a larger number were the inner ring suburbs around St. Louis, of which Ferguson is one. So how do people in Ferguson respond to African Americans living in St. Louis? That's the context I think that we can see the shooting in that does put race more centrally to it. One is they respond with white flight. Whites move out of Ferguson in very dramatic numbers very quickly. And two is they respond with intensity, scrutiny, and targeting of African Americans. This is the Ferguson population across the 20th century into the 21st century. The blue area is white population, which is total population for a long time, really until 1970, when African Americans began to move into the area. By 2010, 2/3 of Ferguson is African American, only 1/3 white, and that's after just a mere 40 years ago, there were very few, if any, African Americans living in Ferguson, Missouri. So one thing you see is from a peak of about 1970, you see the white population shrinking. They're moving away. African Americans are moving in, but the police force is still 92% white in Ferguson, Missouri. We don't have a transition to reflect the new composition of the neighborhood. And so we set up a couple of dynamics. One is, of course, this anxiety in white communities that we've seen manifest across the 20th century about integration. And it's happening in Ferguson. And the people who are supposed to protect whites are the police force. And so how does that manifest in behaviors? Well, we don't have a lot of data, but we do know traffic stops. And we can see the population in Ferguson is population over 16 years old is roughly 1/3 white and 2/3 black. But when you look at traffic stops, 87% of stops are of African Americans, only 13% are of whites. And then when you look at the percent of searches, in other words, the police officer stops a car and then determines that the searches warranted, 92% of the searches are of African Americans and only 8% are of whites. And then, is that because African Americans are more at risk to have things to be found? And it turns out not to be the case. 32% of whites, when searched, have contraband in their car, only 20% of African Americans. So it seems like a disparate behavior in the actions of the police. Darren Wilson shot Michael Brown. He joined a long historical failure to form a racially harmonious, just, and open society. And so I think that Eric and I would probably have more common ground than I've suggested here, but I think that there's a long historical context into which this episode fits. In that context, there's a lot of anxiety about racial integration throughout the St. Louis area, throughout America, really. If you're looking for more stuff, I think there's some excellent things here that I can give you those later. And that's the end, and I think I hit my target time.
Can everybody hear me? I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but try to make it as interesting as I can. Zeroing in on Hall, then Officer Darren Wilson, and Michael Brown. What are the ingredients of a Ferguson type situation? If you consider that, especially some of the elements that Dr. Kelly talked about, the historical perspective, there's a lack of diversity in the police force and in other elements of society. There's a lack of cultural sensitivity and understanding. And I'm not just talking about from the police perspective, I'm also talking about from the community perspective. There's a lot of fear and distrust between law enforcement and the community, especially minorities and African American populations. There's a huge distrust. I'm sure you all have heard of situations in which, you know, a community, something happens in a community and the people don't want to cooperate with the police. These are people who have absolutely nothing to do with the criminal action, but they don't want to cooperate. They don't believe that the police have their best interest at heart. They don't believe that the police can protect them. There's a lack of dialogue. There's a certain amount of ignorance on both sides of the debate. And I would also say that from the community standpoint, I think there's a lack of civil engagement. One of the first things that I saw following this incident was everybody and their mother was on Facebook with an opinion about what happened. But I would venture to guess that some of those same people who had an opinion about what happened don't serve on jury duty, they don't vote, they don't civically engage. I mean, you have to be engaged as a citizen to make changes to these sorts of issues that we have. I would say that there's a certain lack of access to information as well. When I worked for the City of Pittsburgh Solicitor's Office, one of the things that was, you know, universal across all of the cases that I worked is that the City of Pittsburgh Police did not want to divulge to the public what their policies and procedures were. Now, the rationale is that you put officers at risk, but I can't really think of a situation in which knowing the way your public servants are supposed to operate puts the police at risk. Why can't we know? Why isn't there more transparency with our civil servants? I also noticed in the reactions to this situation, certain people trying to take advantage of it and use it as a stage for their own agendas. And this kind of muddies the waters of the debate. There were numerous instances in which people had been accused of various crimes and they wanted to, you know, apologize to the Brown family and reference other instances that, from the perspective of, you know, there being a conflict between law enforcement and a citizen, they wanted to reference those instances, but they weren't similar. One guy, his name is Frederick Young. He's from Detroit. He had killed 2 teenagers, ages 17 and 18, and it was in a scenario in which these young teens apparently were looking for drugs. This guy executed them, took them out to a field, executed them. But at his sentencing, he didn't apologize to the families of the victims. Instead, he apologized to the Brown family. What did his situation have to do with the Michael Brown incident? It really didn't. There's no indication that there was a negative or catastrophic outcome to his encounter with law enforcement. I mean, other than he got arrested for, you know, what he did. But this sort of lack of information, all of these elements that I just mentioned, it snowballs into other things. There's a lack of equal access and equal protection under the law. You end up with racial profiling. You end up with sentencing disparities where, you know, a white individual may be charged with the same crime as a minority, but because of, you know, certain societal constructs, one gets a break, the other doesn't. Now, it's fair that the supporters of each camp, those for the Brown family and those for law enforcement, you know, were outraged. It's a tragic situation, no matter what your opinion is of the outcome. people took to the streets, they took to social media and any other outlet to voice their opinions. People came up with the hands up gesture. I'm sure you all have seen that. They laid out in front of public venues to protest. And then the noise, as it tends to do, kind of died down a little bit. I certainly don't condone the protesting that ended up with destructive rioting, people setting fires to businesses and violently engaging the police. But I do believe that voicing your opinion about these issues is important. We can't wait until we have these huge catastrophic events to talk about it. This should be something that is an ongoing conversation, and our civic engagement should be ongoing. I tend to agree with Dr. Kelly in that I feel like race inevitably enters the conversation. I mean, it's part of who we are as Americans, and I'm not talking about racial discrimination, but inevitably race is a part of who we are. It's, you know, I'm black. You know, I mean, it's a part of who I am. It's you know, not anything that we should shy away from. In fact, we need to open up the dialogue about these racial issues and not try to, you know, cast them off or ignore them. From the legal perspective, I'm sure you all heard about the grand jury's decision not to return criminal charges against then Officer Darren Wilson. Some say that the decision stemmed from several deviations in the normal grand jury process, and that those deviations tainted deliberations. But if you look at the relevant statute, Title 18, Section 242, which is an iteration of the Enforcement Act of 1870, it makes it a federal crime to willfully deprive someone of his constitutional rights under color of any law. In 1909, Congress added a requirement that one must willfully deprive another of his or her rights in order to violate Section 242. With the addition of the willful standard, the court decided that the statute now required a specific intent to violate someone's constitutional rights. Some case law suggests that willful disregard might suffice for the mental element or the mens rea to violate the statute. But assuming that Darren Wilson's shooting of Officer Brown was not legally justified, the most likely scenario is that he acted out of anger, unreasonable fear, ignorance maybe, or both in the heat of the moment, and during a very brief encounter when there was really no time to form the sort of intent required by the Civil Rights Statute. I don't think it's any wonder that he wasn't indicted by the grand jury, but a lot of people don't consider the statute, the relevant statute that was at issue. Regardless of whether it was the right decision or the wrong decision, do we really want to live in a society in which things like this happen, tragic encounters like this happen with our civil servants? If you look at the Constitution, we all know that's the supreme law of the land. We all know that. It delineates the national framework of government. In general, the first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, offer specific protections of individual liberty and justice and place restrictions on the powers of government. Excuse me. The majority of the 17 later amendments expand individual civil rights. One of the Constitution's central commands is that no one can be deprived of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness without due process of law. And law in general tends to restrain freedom so that everyone can enjoy it. So for example, my rights and my freedom are restricted in a sense because it's not fair to impose on your rights and freedom. I can't go speeding down the highway at 90 miles an hour because that puts your life in jeopardy. That's not fair for me to be able to exercise my right to a point where it infringes on yours. So that's part of the issue, or part of the difficulty in looking at situations like this. The definition of, or a definition of civil rights is an enforceable right or privilege, which if interfered with by another, gives rise to an action for injury. Some examples of civil rights are freedom of speech, press and assembly, the right to vote, freedom from involuntary servitude, and the right to equality in public places. Now, speaking a little further on the legal aspect and looking at the then officer, he resigned from duty, Darren Wilson's actions, officers are allowed to meet force with force. Even normal citizens are allowed to defend themselves by the law of self-defense. You can meet an element of attack or aggression with the same level of attack or aggression. You can't go above it. So if you present me with bodily injury, I can defend myself presenting you with bodily injury. If you present serious bodily injury or death to me, I can do the same to you in defending myself. I can't one-up you though. I can't bring a gun to a fist fight, generally speaking. That wouldn't be defending myself. I would then become the aggressor. The same sort of principle applies to law enforcement. They are subject to what's called the use of force doctrine. And in the course of their duties, law enforcement personnel use force to subdue suspects. We all know that. Use of force consists of two parts. The amount of force that may lawfully be used on a continuum that includes deadly force, and the circumstances under which it may be used, including the level of imminent threat reasonably perceived by the member of law enforcement and the concern that a fleeing felon may harm the public. The doctrine is intended to balance security needs with ethical concerns for the rights and well-being of intruders or suspects. Just because you're a criminal doesn't mean you don't have rights. Just because you're alleged to have committed a crime doesn't mean you don't have rights. In the event that members of the public are injured, this may give rise to issues of self-defense, such as justification. In the event of death during a reasonable use of force, this may legally be considered a justifiable homicide. If a case where the use of force has been applied unevenly or unjustly or unfairly occurs, then what we have is a misapplication of the doctrine and essentially police brutality. When people bring civil rights lawsuits against the police, that's essentially what they're saying. They went beyond what the law allows them to do. There are actually a few national guidelines on how police should operate. And each locality kind of deals with, their policies and procedures on an individual basis, and that makes sense. But going back to civic responsibility, for every right there's a correlative duty or responsibility. So we can't sit back as a society and react to these situations without engaging, without looking at wider issues such as poverty, such as the amount of money that we spend on building prisons versus those that we spend on building rehab facilities or mental health facilities. We can't react. I mean, it's not reasonable for us to have such a strong reaction when we're not doing anything. These type of discussions, these are great, but there needs to be an ongoing dialogue between the police and the community. This is just one facet of the racial issue in America, but there certainly needs to be a larger dialogue between the police and the community in order to avoid these situations.
Thank you very much.
So I'm a senior here. I'm an educational psychology major. But I wanted to offer not only my opinion, but my standpoint on this issue. So Dr. Leiner, Dr. Kelly gave the historic and the factual part, so I'm going to give my piece of it. I think that the Michael Brown case is a cry for help for our country. I think that we have made progress since the 60s when civil rights began, but I also think that we have had some regression as well. I think that we have some work to do. I think knowledge is power, which is why I'm in college. And I think that if we educate ourselves properly, we can do more. So I grew up in Pittsburgh, and I went to public school all my life from kindergarten until 12th grade. I went to Sundown Elementary, Frick ISA, and Shinley High School, and then to here. So this is my first plunge into private school. And as an active member of the community and being a part of the public and having both my parents as civil servants, I will say that community is a big part of what happens. And if you don't take your part, as Ms. Candace talked about, then you're not doing your part. And your opinion, I don't want to say it becomes invalid, but it becomes less because you have to be a part of it to make progress. So I think that in order for us to see change, we have to play our part. And I think that starts with educating the community. My aunt is on the Pittsburgh Housing Board, and she's a police officer, and she's been inactive for about 3 years now. But when she worked, she always told me about her cases and things that she dealt with. And in Pittsburgh, I grew up in a diverse area, but I don't want to say Pittsburgh is very diverse. I want to say that I definitely saw different people from different aspects of the community. And so much goes on that we don't know about, and I think that plays a part too. But coming from the legal perspective, I don't offer anything because I don't know much about our justice system. And as far as Michael Brown case, just from what Dr. Koshin talked about, and I learned a lot actually, which is really important. I heard you need to listen to offer an opinion, and you need to take in what is said to you in order to validate your standpoint as well. And I think that the community offers different programs as far as like higher achievement and Act 101s and things that progress African American culture and education, which I think is very important. I think African Americans are not highly represented in the law enforcement field in any standpoint. I mean, I had family members, both my aunt was in the FBI, and they offer different opinions actually on the subject. But I won't get into that. But I think that it's important to educate ourselves about each other. I think that if more African Americans, more Hispanics, more Asians, just other cultures were represented in the law system, that we could have a better perspective on understanding each other. I think fear does something to people. I think fear changes people, and fear makes us act in ways that we would not do otherwise. I think that when you are scared, which I believe Officer Wilson was, that I don't want to say it changed the situation because I don't think that's legitimate. But I think that it's important to say that if you were properly educated about other cultures and you really took the time to know someone, then it might be different. And I'm not saying that this won't happen again, because if Michael Brown was white, then this could still hit the news. It wouldn't be as big of an issue, I'm going to be honest, but I think that it would still be important. But I think that race plays a part in this issue, but it is not the only issue. Education is huge, and I think that we all know that from being educated college students ourselves. I think that racial profiling and discrimination are forms of ignorance, and I think that if we educate ourselves in other cultures, then we can do more to help in the community. My family is very diverse, very diverse. My father is Egyptian and Kenyan, and my mother is African American. She also has some French in her. So I think that offering things to the situation is very important. I think that fear is dangerous, and I think that you can eliminate that by educating yourself and changing it. From different branches of law enforcement, I think are also offered. I don't think African Americans are well represented, so I think it's hard to respond to a situation when you don't know that person. And that's why I think what happened. I think I would be wrong if I said that race meant nothing in the situation. I think it did mean something. I think that's why we know about this case. I think that's why we're all here tonight, and I think this is why our country is in crisis. I think race is very controversial, and I think that it's important to talk about. I think we tend to sweep things under the rug and act like they don't exist, and they come back harder. And we're having this discussion because this happened, and because this is real, and because it matters. And I'm coming to you as a student, not as an activist. So I want to make that clear as well. I think we have to balance ourselves in the community and in every field. I think that everybody should progress in their field and do as much as they possibly can. I think that by putting yourself in community acts and public affairs, that you will know more, that your opinion will mean more, and that you will change more. I myself are choosing to do that for graduate studies. I'm going for public administration. I think that if you truly immerse yourself in something different, that you will become something different and change will occur. So in closing, I want to say that if you knew more, you would do more. Thank you.